Hey everyone, John Deere here from John Deere's Embroidery Legacy, and last week we released part one of our history of our legacy, and I wanted to share a little bit more background with you. One of the main things that my grandparents did from the 1950s all the way through to the early 90s was we worked extensively with Girl Guides and Boy Scouts. And I remember as a child in the factory seeing groups of Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts come through our factory because they used to come through tours to see where the emblems were made. And I remember as a little kid seeing these guys and they're running around the factory and they had uniforms on. And of course I wanted to be like one of them. So I did join Cub Scouts and then I became a Boy Scout a little later on. And it was kind of a funny situation though, because nobody really knew what my family did in the industry. And I remember my father took me to my first cubbery, or jamboree I guess as they called them. And I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And at those jamborees, everybody would get around at nighttime and you'd sit around the campfire. And if you know anything about scouting, some of these scout leaders are pretty serious about their collecting of badges. So they all sit around the campfire and everybody puts on what's called a scout blanket. And on this blanket, you would put all of your patches on. And there was all these old timers sitting there and they had their scout blankets on. And I ended up coming to the campfire and I saw all these guys and their jaws just dropped. And the reason why is for some reason my grandmother since the early 60s had saved a lot of the emblems that we did for the scout industry. And keeping in mind that we actually did about, I think, 4 million brownie emblems a year alone, and then the scouts and everything else that we did. So she saved a few of these as time went on, and then when I got into being a Cub Scout, my grandmother decided to make me a scout blanket. And I pulled up to the campfire with this huge scout blanket that was loaded with hundreds and hundreds of patches, the regional patches and all that kind of stuff. So this is actually a little bit of our legacy, and as you can see on the table here, we have hundreds and hundreds of scouting badges, and this is part of my childhood growing up. And the funny thing is, my grandmother first started collecting badges for me, and I only have 2 of them from 1960. So these are actually scouting emblems from 1960. So these are like 59 years old at this point. And then it moves over to 61 and 64, 62, 66, going all the way through up into the 80s. And the beautiful part of this is, this is part of my treasure, I guess, as a child, and I've kept these all this year, and we'll pass this down throughout the legacy. I know James is going to be posting some pictures on there, so you can see a few more close-ups. But going into the late 80s and 90s, when I was a digitizer and a shifley puncher, I started to actually punch some of the emblems myself. And I do have a couple here that I remember. I did this series, and I started in 1990 all the way through to 1995. And I digitized that complete set, and I know that going through some of these, I know I did this one. If I rifled through some others, I know that I did some others as well. So it's kind of cool because these were done by old school punchers. You got to remember that in the old days, we did not embroider directly on shirts. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I guess in the 80s we started to get into multi-head equipment and direct-to-garment, directly onto the garment machines with smaller hoops. But in the old days, if you wanted embroidery on a jacket or something, you basically had an emblem or a patch made with a marrow edge or a lock stitch edge. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this little story, and this is all part of our legacy. Now, I almost forgot, as a little teaser, you're going to want to make sure that you check out next week's video as well, and that will be before we release part 2 of our History of the Legacy series. If you didn't check out part 1, be sure to check it out because it's just amazing how my grandparents started our business and what we did and how we did it in the early days of embroidery. Now, one thing that my grandfather did do when he was involved in the business was sales, and he was an incredible salesperson. He actually developed lines for the tourist industry. He was the one who got all the sales for the big contracts, and one of the companies that he actually ended up closing in the early 70s was a company that you may have heard of before. They have a few cute little characters, but that would be Walt Disney World. And in the early 70s, my grandfather actually had the licensing rights to do emblems for Walt Disney World. You have to remember that in the early 70s, you did not have Walt Disney, images that were directly sewn onto garments. There was no such thing as direct-to-garment embroidery at that point. Everything in those days was done with emblems. So this was way back when. The cool thing about these is this is the original packaging from the 70s. So you're going to want to make sure that you stay tuned next week and check that out. Hi, John Deere here, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like down below. To join the legacy now, hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell to be notified every time we release a new video. It's no mystery, award-winning embroidery is our history.